Everybody, and welcome. Today I'm going to be giving you a rundown of our project Nike Gradient. Now for this assignment, what we're going to be doing is using our selection tools to select parts of our shoe here, and then we're going to fill it with a gradient. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with downloading our Photoshop document by clicking here. We'll go ahead, click download, and then once that downloads, let's drag and drop that right onto our desktop. Once we have this airmax.jpg on our desktop, let's go ahead and hold Control on our keyboard and click. We'll go open with Adobe Photoshop. Once we get this opened up in Photoshop, we're pretty much going to be using our quick selection tools and our gradient tools for this assignment. So really just those two. So let's get into it. First things first, let's grab our quick selection tool. It should be the fourth tool down. If you do not see it, it might be behind your object selection tool. So all you need to do is click and hold whichever tool is there and select your quick selection tool. It should look like a paintbrush with some dotted lines around it. Now that we have our quick selection tool, let's go ahead and start making our selections. I'm going to start at the bottom of the shoe with the sole here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click the section that I want to start filling in. And then I'll see my dotted marching ants going around that selection as well. Now notice I missed this section over here. That's okay. What I'm going to do is just hold Shift, and I'm going to select that section as well. And I'm just going to click until I fill all of this in. Now it might be easier if you zoom in by hitting Command plus, so you can make sure that you get that whole selection there. Once you have your entire selection made, now it's time to use our gradient tool to start filling in our gradient. So if we look here, we'll see that my gradient tool is right under my eraser, which is where yours should be. You can also press G to get gradient on your keyboard as well. If you don't see this tool, it could be behind your paint bucket tool, which would look something like this. If that's the case, just go ahead and click and hold on that paint bucket tool so you can select your gradient tool. So once we have our gradient tool selected, we can see our type of gradient up here. So if we look, we have our colors. We also have, is it making a linear gradient? Is it making a radial gradient or an angle gradient? I would suggest to just start off with your linear gradient until you get familiar with it, and then you can get a little wild and crazy and start using maybe some of these other ones here. But for the most part, it should look something like this, all your settings. Now, we want to select our colors. So the first thing we want to do is notice how I have yellow and purple selected. You can change these to be whatever color you want just by double clicking the color that you want to change. And let's say I want this to be red and black versus yellow and purple. All I would need to do is just find a nice red color here. And then if I wanted to change this purple, I just need to double click that purple. And then I can maybe select a black. And these can be whatever colors you want. So feel free to kind of play around. You can also change them later if you want. Now that we have our selection tool made and we are ready to use our gradient tool, all we need to do is with our gradient tool selected, we're just going to click, hold, and drag this little line out here, and that's going to set your gradient. Now, notice how if I click and hold again and just drag it a little bit smaller, notice how my gradient is much shorter. So if you want that gradient to be a little bit longer throughout the entirety of the shoe, you would make your line a little bit longer. If you go even further, it's going to take it even further past the shoe. So what I want you to do is just be sure you're playing around with kind of where these gradients are happening. And just experiment with the tool itself. What happens if you go left to right? Or what happens if you drag at an angle? So spend some time playing around with this before you move on to your next selection, because this could dictate kind of where your gradients would line up on your shoe and maybe what might make sense and what wouldn't make sense. So feel free to play around. Now, once you have made your selection and you're like, this is how I want my gradient, it looks great, go ahead and hit Command and D on your keyboard, and we're going to move on to another selection. So then we'll go grab our quick selection tool. We're going to select another part of the shoe. Make sure you have the entire part selected that you want. Now, again, if you end up selecting something you don't want, you just need to hit that Command Z to undo. Or what you could do is just hold that Option button, and then you could subtract from your selection versus adding to your selection. Now, notice how I'm having a hard time getting this exact. That's okay. If I zoom in just a little bit closer, and if I make my size of this just a little bit smaller, I can get a much more accurate selection here. And then once you have your selection made, all you need to do is then use your gradient again, which is under your eraser, and then play around with what happens when you start adding in some more lines. Now, what happens if you have a gradient going from left to right and then you get crazy and go from the right to the left? What does that look like? What happens if you start playing around with it up and down? Things like this. So I can't wait to see kind of what yours ends up like. Feel free to experiment with different colors. It doesn't necessarily just have to be two colors. What happens when you make another gradient? It maybe slowly starts going from red to then purple to black or something like that. So I can't wait to see what you end up making. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and I will be with you as soon as I can.